Thank you everyone for really appreciate it. Max is going to give the bulk of this talk, but I thought I'd introduce Woods for the Trees, who we are and what we do first. So we are a new community interest company since March this year. It's a bit of a lockdown project for us all. And what we stand for is we try to encourage people to create new woodlands. So that's volunteers. Anyone who wants to plant trees, we look for them. We also look for landowners, including councils, schools, etc. Anyone who has some land on which they would like trees to be planted, we put the two of them together, and we also give lots of advice about how to negotiate all the bureaucracy to get that going. And Max is an expert on all that, and he'll be talking in a minute. Max has also written 3 books about trees, and here they are. And you can buy these from our website, and half of that money that you pay recommended retail price, and half of that will go towards sustaining us as a CIC. So let me hand over to Max now. Max knows a lot more about trees than I do, as you can probably guess. Thank you, Max.
Thanks, Jonathan. Hello, everybody. It's nice to have you join us on Sunday afternoon. Yeah, I do write books about trees, and I've been working with woodlands for, I suppose, about 30 years now. Back in the day, in 1993, I think I was the first person ever to get a mortgage on a woodland with the Ecology Building Society, but times have changed a bit. I'm, by original profession and training, I'm an archaeologist, and although I have a very strong attachment to trees and I'm passionate about how we might use them in addressing climate change issues, I'm really particularly interested in how people inhabit landscapes and how cultures interact with their environment. And that's really what I want to address today. The Cambridge Zero Conference will introduce all sorts of discussions and debates and ideas about how we go forward with climate change and controlling our carbon output and absorbing carbon and so on. But I want to do 2 things today. One is I want to introduce to you the idea of what I'm calling social ecology, the social ecology of woodlands. And I want to show you how I think a global vision of social ecology can have very local solutions. And because I was particularly asked to, and because we're representing Cambridge Zero here, I will be looking at Cambridge itself. I don't know Cambridge all that well, but and I'm speaking from the northern edge of County Durham, but I think we can say something useful and relevant about what may or may not be going on in Cambridge. So without further ado, I think Jonathan is going to run a poll now. Just out of interest, it would be nice to find out what your thoughts are on top priorities. And if you open your conversation, there's at the top of your screen, if you don't know this, click on the thing that looks like a speech bubble, and you should be able to see the chat, and then you can click on one of these 4 options just to register your opinion. Should we be planting more trees to get up to the European average? I think Europe's average is upper 20s, low 30% of woodland cover. UK is less than 10, I think, at the moment. Should we, instead of planting trees, allow woodland to naturally regenerate? Should we just keep the woods that we've got and look after our ancient woodlands? Or should we, for example, be planting huge amounts of willow biomass to fuel our power stations and keep our electricity running? I'm, like you, going to vote, and we'll see where we get to, and hopefully as many of you will vote as possible. So I see naturally regenerated woodland is in the lead at the moment. We'll revisit this theme, I dare say, later on. But the more of you who can click, the better.
Any more responses? Don't be shy.
Nobody's voting for poor old willow biomass.
Maybe you need to say a little bit more about that, Max.
Oh, yes. I mean, you see them around these willow plantations. Willow, of course, grows like absolute stink, and therefore looks like it's a good thing to do. And if you're planting willow biomass for fuel, you're not using fossil fuels. The thinking being that every time you burn willow, you're replacing, you're drawing in the carbon that you release from burning it into new willow plantations. In other words, it's the cover of the trees that counts rather than what you do with them. How are we doing? Yeah, keep woodland covered as it is and conserve ancient woodlands. Well, I'm sure everyone agrees we should conserve ancient woodlands, although how we do that is another matter. But nobody's voting for that. So we've only had 4 responses. Well, that may be because people can't see that, Jonathan. Anyway, should we move on?
So if you go, just give you one more chance. If you go to your chat, which is the speech bubble icon up at the top, then you should be able to access the vote. Let's give that one more go.
We have other votes.
Okay, we have other votes. Let's move on to the next one.
Okay. So moving on to the ideas about what we should use wood for, is I suppose the question one asks is wood still relevant to us? Should we use more wood instead of plastics? Obviously, plastics come from the refining oil. Should we stop using wood to conserve forests and woodlands? That is, should we stop using things like paper, toilet paper, paper for printing, wood for buildings? Should we import more timber? That's a slightly loaded question. Britain, or the UK, is the 5th largest importer of timber globally, which is fairly astonishing, really. Or should we be recycling more wood and timber? What would your top priority be? Well, I know what mine is. So we have a vote to stop using wood. That's good, because that's going to create a debate, I hope. Use more wood, recycle wood and timber as top priority. Yeah. So we appear to only have 4 people voting, Jonathan, so I suspect some people can't, and they haven't found the buttons.
Okay, well
the buttons aren't working, maybe.
I guess if you can use the chat, you can put in your vote that way, and we will count it.
Yeah. Okay, well, we'll move on. Another question to ask at the beginning, I suppose, is if we do want to plant more trees in the UK, how should we incentivize that? If you think about where our subsidies go in a post-Brexit world, there is a huge emphasis on subsidising sheep farming in this country, partly because it keeps sheep farmers alive in communities where otherwise there's not a huge amount of economic activity. It uses land which supposedly is not much used for anything else. So should we be paying people to plant woodlands? There is a new English woodland creation offer at the moment, and there are comparable schemes in Scotland and Northern Ireland and Wales. So should we be paying people to plant trees, and who should we be paying to plant trees? Should the government and the Forestry Commission be planting trees on our behalf? The government has plans to plant stupendously large numbers of hectares over the next 20 years. Is that going to work? Should we have community-driven schemes from the ground up? And lastly, should we be paying people for the amount of carbon that they can absorb by planting woodlands, so that this is my loaded answer, so that gas guzzling international corporations can absolve their guilt. I shouldn't really prejudice your replies, but there you go, I have probably. So anyway, those are really straw polls just to sort of get us thinking about, I suppose, the complexity involved. Everybody knows it's a good idea to plant trees, or at least have more trees in the world, but it's not quite as simple as just plant trees or just let trees regenerate. There are considerable complexities. Anyway, somebody in the lobby.
Yes, I'm letting them in. Thank you.
Okay.
Margaret, you're still trying to get in the lobby, so if you could maybe withdraw your request to join from your laptop, that would be fantastic, since you can see us already. Okay, thank you.
Okay, I want to sort of spin a narrative here. This is an aerial photograph, and there's no reason why anybody should guess where it is. It's not a quiz. Right in the center of this slide, you can see, if I can get my laser pointer going, you can see a building. It's a rectangular building, and it looks rather like quite a lot of other rectangular buildings. This is a building called Cowan Court. You may just be able to see it appears to have trees in the quadrangle. This is a building called Cowan Court, and it belongs to and is part of Churchill College in Cambridge. And it's a student, I think it's a student accommodation building. And I just want to talk a little bit about it, since we are hosted very kindly by Cambridge Climate Zero. Well, here's an image on the left of this building. You can see, in fact, that it's not really quite as straight-sided as it looks. It has echoes of a classical facade. But this building was constructed by 6A architects in 2016. It's very substantially a wooden building. The core of the building has some concrete, but essentially it's a wooden engineered building. So it consists of structural members which utilize a technology called glulam, which is pretty much what it sounds like. Imagine taking a plank or a board and sticking another one on top, and then another one on another, and gluing them together or bolting them together, and you can create very large structural beams which you can steam bend and create in almost any shape. The largest, I think, glulam building in the world is an American football stadium. I can't remember if it's Texas or somewhere like that. Anyway, it's hundreds and hundreds of feet across, and it's held up by these wonderful glulam laminated beams. And the walls are essentially made of something called CLT, which is cross-laminated timber. So imagine if glulam works by sandwiching boards like that, planks like that, then CLT works the opposite way. It works like plywood. So you get a board made up of a number of planks, and then you lay planks the other direction, and then again. So essentially you create giant plywood, and that holds the walls up. And essentially then, if you want doors and windows and any other entrances, you just cut through them. And I've been having a look at these wooden engineered buildings. There are now more than 100 of them in the UK. The tallest wooden engineered building at the moment, but it won't be for long, is an 84-metre, so that's nearly 300 feet high apartment block in a place called Mjøstarnet in Norway. That's probably a mispronunciation. In theory, there's no limit to the height of a wooden engineered building now. So this is the future of technology. The question is, of course, where does the timber come from? Well, I think most of the timber for Cowan Court will have been imported from Norway and Sweden, which is where we import most of our structural timber from. But I understand that the cladding that you can see is recycled French railway sleepers, which is rather nice. And of course, you can think about all the carbon implications of importing the timber for a wooden building. And lots of people are concerned, especially post-Grenfell, that wooden timber buildings burn down. Of course, many wooden buildings have burnt down. We can go into that later if anybody's particularly interested, but there are very good reasons for building buildings out of wood, and very good reasons why they will retain their structural integrity longer than equivalent steel and concrete buildings. Now, one of the things I want you to look at on this slide is the timber volume. 314 cubic meters of timber volume. And by comparison, I want you to look at another building which no longer stands. This is the Fortune Playhouse in London. It was built in 1599 by an architect called Peter Street. He probably wouldn't have called himself an architect. It was modelled on the Globe Theatre, which had just been finished on the South Bank. And if you look, the timber volume, I've calculated this because we have a very, very detailed record of where the timber came from and how much timber was used in this building. It's an extraordinary piece of history. So the Fortune Playhouse used roughly half the timber volume of Cowan Court. And I don't know why I think that's interesting, but I think it is. And it might pique your interest too. I haven't got a timber volume for the current Globe Theatre. But it'd be quite interesting to know how much timber they've used. Okay, well, let's go back to Cambridge. Now, if I can start my laser pointer again. That aerial photograph I showed you, this is Cowan Court, just bang in the centre of this image. The medieval centre of Cambridge on the River Cam is just the other side of the river, but essentially round here. And this being an Ordnance Survey map, you'll see there are patches of trees which are shown, oops, beg your pardon, patches of trees which are shown. If we zoom out from this picture and see Cambridge in its wider setting, one thing that is very striking is that there is a vanishingly small amount of woodland in this image. And that's not a modern feature of Cambridge. It's low-lying fen country, essentially, with hills to the southeast, but nothing much to the north and west. Traditionally, going back thousands of years, these were peatlands and the low-lying wetlands surrounding the Wash, and the sort of landscape where hermits wanting to escape from it all would come and dig themselves a pit and live in it, as St Guthlac did in the 8th century. But in terms of social ecology, the point I want to make here is that there are many positive things to say about building out of wood, and some negatives too, but there are some very positive things. But one thing is perfectly clear: the timber to build a building like Cowan Court in the centre of Cambridge University could not have come from Cambridge. There isn't any woodland in the vicinity of Cambridge, certainly not the sort of woodland that will produce structural timber. And what I want to do in the next half hour is to try and square that circle, or circle that square, and try and understand how that relationship between buildings and trees and people can be potentially a more enriching way than just thinking it's a good thing to put a wooden building up, out with the context of the area it's put up and the people. I very much doubt if anyone living in Cambridge planted any of the trees, it would be lovely to be proved wrong, planted any of the trees that went into Cowan Court, or indeed were much involved with felling them or looking after them during their lifetime. So I want to use that thought as a launch pad to take a very, very brief look at what I call the Wood Age. I've just written a book about the history of the human relationship with wood over the last 500,000 years or so. In fact, our relationship with wood as a technology goes back to before modern humans. The great apes are great wood technologists. They know how to construct shelters. They know how to dig for roots. They know how to poke around for ants in nests with wood. But the human relationship with wood is one that has driven our technological culture as a species over the last 500,000 years. And this time next year, the book will be out. But what I want to draw your attention to is some aspects of what I call the wood age, which I mean, in a sense, the wood age hasn't finished, but I sort of think of it ending with the construction of the iron bridge at Coalbrookdale in 1779, which was constructed using cast iron members, but using carpentry joints. And for some reason, it has a sort of iconic status as a building that marks the end of the period during which wood is the primary technology in human technological cultural progress. This, by the way, if you don't know it, is not just a rather beautiful picture, but it's actually a woodcut by the wonderful Claire Leighton, who was an American artist who lived in Britain for many years in the early part of the 20th century. And it's a portrayal of bodgers. But bodgers were not, as they are now, people whose skills in woodworking are pejoratively maligned. I have to confess I'm a bit of a bodger, but a bodger was someone who made chair legs. And here are two bodgers, one of whom is cleaving billets, rather braver than I am with an axe. And behind it is shelter, where you see the pole that disappears into his shelter. Well, that's running his pole lathe, which is a foot-powered lathe that will turn these billets of wood into chair legs and spindles. And his friend or assistant is, I can't quite working out what he's doing, but something to do with chair bodging. And down in the right-hand corner, you can see the stumps of a felled tree and a tool called a beetle, which is a bloody great lump of wood like a hammer used for splitting wood. It's one of the great misconceptions about wood is that you shouldn't cut trees down. Most broadleaf trees, when cut down, will regrow from the stump. Anyone who's tried to get rid of an ash tree in their garden knows the truth of this. You try and cut an ash tree down and it simply grow again. Most trees grow again from their stumps. We'll revisit that theme, I dare say, as we go on. So, the wood age. In the wood age, and I suppose peak wood, if you want to call it that, could be seen in the early medieval landscape of the British Isles quite easily. Indeed, there are parts of Europe which are very heavily wooded and still heavily reliant on wooden ecologies and economies. This is a little patch of the Northumberland that I study with my colleagues in the Bernician Studies group, some of whom are with us today. What you can see here is a medieval township called Netherwhitton, and its boundaries are marked in orange. It's called Netherwhitton now, and 1,000 years ago it was called Wotton, W-O-T-T-O-N. And Wotton means the estate where wood is grown, or the estate where wood is obtained. So 1,000 years ago, this township, which is the equivalent of a southern parish, was producing all the woodland for an estate. And it was a specific resource component of that estate. And presumably the people who lived on the estate of Wotton were actively participating in the growing, planting, managing, participating and felling and supplying of wood to their lords. And indeed, it's the sort of place where you'd expect to have people whose surnames in the medieval period would have been Barker and Turner and Pallister and Forrester and Collier. And the name Collier, incidentally, is not from people dealing in coal, but in charcoal. So there would have been charcoal burners and people tanning leather with bark from oak. There would have been pigs being turned out into pastures in the autumn. So it was a highly wooded economy. And if we look at a village from not very far away in the 17th century, you can see the sort of classic pattern of how the centrifugal nature of human landscape interaction, which started at the center with the village and its row or a grid of houses with their little tofts and crofts leading off to the back where they would grow their vegetables and keep perhaps a cow, perhaps a pig or a goat. Then fields immediately after that. And then further out, you would have your common pastures and wastes and your woodland. here we have woodland here, woodland, and woodland. And it's a rather fun exercise, I think, to take a Google satellite or a Bing satellite map and just travel around the world vicariously and see how many communities around the world still have this centrifugal concentric pattern of resource management, with woods very much on the periphery, but still vitally important for those communities for whom wood technologies lay at the heart of their society. And here is a little sort of mind map, if you like, of wood age technologies. And at the center, along the line from the center, you have essential technologies: food production, dwelling, fuel, metallurgy, transport, arts and crafts. And above those, the technologies that that support those economic activities: joinery, leverage, tools, fire, architecture, containers, all the way up to furniture, musical instruments, mills, pulley gears, cams, and traction. And then at the bottom, the people whose livelihoods are intimately linked to those economies and technologies: foragers, or hunter-gatherers, cultivators, artisans, shipwrights, wheelwrights, and so on. So in peak wood, we find people heavily integrated with the resources that woods provide. And although we think of our ancestors as having profligately cut down all our trees to make things with, the truth is that woodland is lost for agriculture primarily and grazing. People whose livelihoods depend on wood tend to keep their woodlands in good order. It's not charcoal burners who get rid of woodlands. It is there are two ways of doing it. One, you grub up a wood, which is actually a technically very difficult thing to do. You grub up a wood to plant crops or graze, and you see this happening all the time in the Amazon. Or you let so many animals into your woodland that the woodland never again naturally regenerates. Essentially, it tumbles down from woodland to wood pasture to pasture with a few trees. So it's a myth that wood technologists cut down all the trees, especially the blame always goes to the British Navy, which did not, generally speaking, source its trees and its wood by cutting down woods that would never grow again. Essentially, the woodland cover we have in Britain is a Bronze Age phenomenon. So certainly more than 3,000 years ago, our landscape was essentially losing most of its trees, and that hasn't much changed until today, when our woodland cover is slowly increasing. So don't blame the shipbuilders and the charcoal burners. Well, here's a wonderful image of a wood age society. This, of course, is an aristocratic view of how peasants live, and it's from the Les Très Riches of the Duc de Berry in about 1410 to 20, and this is the month of February. Obviously, aristocrats think that peasants have nothing better to do than warm their skirts in front of a fire. But look how much wood technology there is. At the top of the picture, you have the buildings of a village. Many of them will have been wood. You have someone carrying a mule laden with wood up to the village for firewood. You have someone hewing trees down. You have hurdles made of wood, buildings made of wood, carts made of wood, barrels made of wood. And just behind those birds, which I think are jackdaws, aren't they? You see faggots. And a faggot is essentially a bundle of brushwood that is tied very tightly. And what you would do with that is you would essentially chuck these into your communal bread oven and fire the oven. And then when the fire was out, then you would put your bread in it. So the role of the faggot, the bundle of brushwood in wood age societies, is something that's hard to envisage today, because most people wouldn't think that stuff had a use. And yet throughout the wood age, people were zealous in defending their right to collect faggots from their lord's woodland. And indeed, there was a specific clause in many woodland laws to the effect that so and so have the right to collect wood by hook or by crook, which means by billock or by a crook, which is basically a long stick with a hook on the end. So essentially anything that was dead you could take away, but not living trees. So you could pull down dead branches and take them away for your firewood or your bundle of faggots. Hence the term by hook or by crook. Alongside these technologies, as that picture shows, we have a really deeply integrated social ecology of wood, which moves all the way from our earliest human endeavours as foragers, hunter-gatherers, nomads, if you like, long-distance pastoralists and transhumants, through sedentism, when we begin to cultivate land, utilising forest gardens, clearing woodlands for arable, using wood pasture, sending our pigs and livestock into the woods in autumn to fatten on acorns and beech mast, through a period of lordship and overlordship where increasingly critical resources of wood are being managed very, very carefully by a hierarchy of lordship, which allowed at the bottom people who needed for their livelihoods to rely on wood were able to do so, and of course were rapaciously taxed for the privilege. There's an extraordinary entry in a book called Bolden Book, which is our sort of Durham equivalent of Doomsday, in which 3 turners, those are people who run pole lathes and turn things like chair legs and bowls, 3 turners who held land from the Bishop of Durham had to render 3,100 wooden bowls to him as tax before they could earn their own living, which seems absolutely extraordinary, but probably not surprising. And indeed, there's another clause in Bolden Book which tells of how the tenants of the bishop, every year during the bishop's great hunt that would take place in the woods around Auckland in County Durham, would have to build him a hall 60 foot long for him to feast his guests in, and build him a chapel out of wood. It's a highly integrated ecology here. And of course, if you think of the individual constituencies in those ecologies, you have artisans who use wood to add value to it, to make things, architects, machinists, people who are trading valuable woods overseas and so on. You have stewards who of course are zealously defending their lord's rights and keeping people out that they don't want. You have people whose lives are spent in the woodlands, coppicers and woodlanders. And then you have farmers whose lives are bounded by wooden fences and gates and the buildings they live in and work in. So we have a highly integrated social ecology in the Wood Age, which keeps everybody bonded literally and physically into the idea of trees and wood. And if you right into the 19th century, long after the end of the Wood Age, really, if you read something like Thomas Hardy's Woodlanders, you see this extraordinarily intimate relationship at a local level between people and trees and woods, the depth of knowledge people had about wood, the different types of species, how they grew best. In Japan, of course, where wood technology was at its peak over the last 2,000 years, there's no finer wooden technology than Japan. You have extraordinarily detailed knowledge of ancient woodworking techniques, and woodlands being looked after for very specific purposes. So the great Japanese temples had their own forests, and every structural timber had to be taken from a particular part of the forest to ensure that it was the right timber for the right part of the job. It was a sort of sacred relationship with wood and trees that you can still just about see in Japan, but you don't see much in Britain. You would certainly in the late 20th century, a friend and colleague of mine, Bridget Gubbins, travelled widely in Central Europe, and she saw the end of a wood age still ecologically in I won't say harmony is the wrong word, but certainly an ecology, social ecology, intimately connected with woodland in Romania, for example. I don't know if it's still the case in Romania, but even 20 years ago it was. So you probably gather from what I'm saying that I think that trees and woods and people as an integrated ecology are perhaps less understood now than they might be. And I think you can see that in some of the more extreme tree planting schemes that we see now. This is a really extreme example. A lot of people object, and I think quite rightly, to this sort of scheme. What you see is a sort of regimented monoculture of trees planted in plastic tree tubes. And as we know, quite a lot of tree planters don't bother taking these tubes off. They plant the trees and forget them. What I think is essentially missing from this image is the social ecology of people. When these trees are about 10 years old, it won't be possible to walk anywhere in this treed landscape. You won't be able to move around in it. There's no open space. There are no rides to let light in. The canopy will close, and the ecological diversity, having begun so promisingly with lots of new trees, will decline year on year. It's difficult to see how you could harvest any timber, let alone faggots, or send your pigs into a landscape like this. It's actually very difficult to see why you would plant trees like this, unless it's just for the sake of planting trees. And I think this sort of scheme is the result of an obsession with carbon capture over the real issue as I see it, and I do take I have an opinionated view on this, which is that actually above climate and carbon, we ought to be thinking about habitat and landscape and environment, because central to the philosophy of Woods for the Trees is the integration of people back into their landscape, educating people about trees, educating people by getting them to plant trees, to invest their labor in trees, to invest their knowledge in landscapes, and ultimately to profit from trees as they're doing so. This seems to me to be a landscape that excludes human beings. And if we are to exclude human beings from the actual process of addressing climate change and the reasons why we need to address climate change, then I think a trick has been missed here. But we will perhaps look at that a bit more when we start to chat and ask questions. So what I'm suggesting here, what Woods for the Trees in a sense stands for, is this idea of social ecologies, where native trees can be reintroduced by regeneration, which is great for places where there are already treed landscapes. I'm just about to plant 15 acres of on the edge of the Durham Pennines. The nearest tree is quite a way away, and it would take 50 years to naturally regenerate with trees, and there's nothing wrong with that. That's a perfectly reasonable thing to do. I happen to be a bit more impatient. And at the top of this image, you'll see a sheep pasture that is becoming a small woodland, now much more advanced than that image shows. And this is a plantation that I've had for 8 years now. And people often say to me, you shouldn't be planting trees because it takes 80 or 100 years to develop the sort of ecology that you get in an ancient woodland, where you get mature trees, you get dying trees, you get all the invertebrates in the soil that are processing leaf mold and rotting wood. You get the rich sort of ground flora that you see in the bottom picture, which is woodruff. You get all the different species who are inhabiting all the niches in a woodland. Well, I have to say I differ with the mainstream in some respects, in that I understand that it will take 80 or 100 years for my plantation to become like an ancient wood in terms of habitat and carbon storage. that's not a reason not to start doing it now. And I would also say that having watched this wood grow from tiny sticks in a field to trees which are 20 feet tall, as they are, or as many of them are now, I can say that I think there is a very special ecology developing in this plantation, which is a plantation ecology. It's not an ancient woodland ecology, and nor is it a grassland ecology. We have an explosion of rodents, for example, because it's not sheep pasture anymore. There's a huge amount of cover for voles, and those voles support 3 breeding pairs of owls, tawny owls, barn owls, and long-eared owls. We have foxes and kestrels and kites, and if you walk along a ride in the early autumn at dawn, as I did this morning, you will end up absolutely covered in cobwebs, because there are just billions of spiders doing their thing. And if there are spiders doing their thing, lots of other things are doing their thing too. So I'm a champion of young plantation ecologies, but they do demand nurturing. They demand a lot of open space. They demand managing and protecting. And incidentally, before I leave this slide, so I want people in woods. I want people planting trees. That's the philosophy of Woods for the Trees. Incidentally, on the left here, the rather skeptical man looking at that piece of wood, that's the famous Ben Law, who 20 years ago built his own house in a prickly nut wood in Sussex, and was filmed by Kevin MacLeod for Grand Designs. Ben is one of the great advocates for the woodland way of life and for what you can do with wood, using it as a building material. The village store where Ben lives, he built from wood, from his wood. Whereas if you think about Cowan Court in Cambridge, the amount of Cambridge trees that went into that building is, if I may misuse the conference title, Cambridge Zero. So what can we do about that? Well, I can't do anything in Cambridge, although we'd love to hear from volunteers in the Cambridge area who'd like to plant trees, and we'd love to hear from people who've got land in the Cambridge area who'd like to have trees planted on their land. That's what we do. We're a dating service for people and trees and landscapes. But here's an example of social ecology in action, and I think it's win-win. Woods for the Trees, we have a charity partner called the Human Milk Foundation. You may never have heard of them, but I think you will soon if you haven't already. Essentially, preterm babies can struggle desperately to get proper breast milk. Their mothers can't always provide it, and there is no artificial replacement for colostrum with all its tremendous immunization properties and all the other things that it does to help a premature baby develop into a healthy child. Human milk and the Human Milk Foundation collects breast milk from women who've got it to spare, and it filters it, processes it, stores it, and gives it to babies who need it badly, and it saves lives. They're brilliant people, and they got in touch with us because they thought there was a parallel between nursing mothers and nurseries and trees and growing and nurturing, and they have this lovely idea that they're all obviously Dylan Thomas fans. They have this lovely idea of planting a milk wood, and they got in touch with us and asked us if we would plant them a milk wood, and we said no, we won't, but we will help you to plant the milk wood. We will give you the skill. We will help you to acquire the skill set and the people and the land to do this. And we've just had a very encouraging series of meetings with a university, a Russell Group university. I can't tell you where this picture is because the deal hasn't quite been signed off, but I've had a very productive meeting with a local university who are about to get a Human Milk Foundation hub. Indeed, the hospital where that milk will go is here. And right next to it is a city university that has identified 3 pieces of land, which they're very, very kindly going to let us play with. Let us plant trees, let us advertise the Human Milk Foundation, let us advertise Woods for the Trees, let us advertise social ecologies and woodlands, and it's a brilliant opportunity to integrate trees, woodland, people, students, members of the public, people who need human milk, and people who benefit from having had it. So this is a social ecology scheme at work. And I don't think it's beyond the realms that people active in any local community, and hello Cambridge here, or indeed I know we have a participant from Trinity College in Dublin. I wonder if Trinity College, well, yeah, Trinity College has got some land. I think there are partnerships to be made with local authorities, with NGOs, with corporations, with universities, to get planting trees, but to get people involved in that social ecology for everybody's benefit, for the future value of trees, for mindfulness and many other benefits. So that, if you like, is our sort of manifesto message. And I see where time is moving on. Jonathan's our timekeeper, so he will make a secret signal when I have to move on. Okay, so we saw a plantation there, which was just row upon row of trees, and I just want us to think really about a bigger picture, a bigger vision. So we've got plantation ecologies, we've got things that woodlands produce sustainably. Coppice trees will live much longer than uncoppice trees, and can produce all sorts of things sustainably for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And what are the social benefits of planting? Well, it would be lovely, perhaps in chat afterwards, or perhaps in the coming week or so, if people might like to think about these things and perhaps rewatch this and contribute to an ongoing discussion that we'll have on our webinar page on the website. Here are just a few thoughts, back of an envelope thoughts that I've had, or that we at Woods for the Trees have had, to show how habitats, soil, the climate value of trees, the human landscape value of people in woodlands, the produce of trees, and the social benefits can all link together with tree planting and understanding of woods, and reconnecting us with a sort of woody ecology. And I'd like to think that those who think it is wrong to plant trees per se fundamentally would reconsider that viewpoint, given those potentially complex and nuanced benefits for planting trees. Even accepting that a young tree plantation won't necessarily become mature for 100 years, it might be producing apples in 5 years. And indeed, my own plantation, Thistlewood, is only 8 years old, and I am propagating trees from seeds that grew on trees I planted 7 or 8 years ago. That's how quickly a plantation can be productive, regardless of its other ecologies. So here's something to hopefully get some people involved in thinking about. The reason Woods for the Trees started was because our colleague Stuart Davis, who can't be with us today, said to me he sympathises with Extinction Rebellion and climate protest groups. He said, but wouldn't it be more productive if they could actually do something positive? And I do feel people generally feel excluded from the business, the process of structurally taking climate change and habitat loss on. I think that's partly because most people don't have access to land. Land is still a perquisite of inherited wealth by and large. People don't know how to get involved, and people don't know where to get involved. So here are some questions. Jonathan, we're going to do this through the chat.
Yeah, I thought maybe Max, in the interest of time, what we could do is show that, then ask people if they have anything to add to the list.
So yeah, if you'd like to open your chat lines, and we can see what people are saying. And
yeah, so if you have any other thoughts to add to this,
yeah,
where we get all the trees from.
Okay. One thing we do know while you're typing messages, hopefully, is that all the tree nurseries in Britain cannot supply the projected tree planting requirement over the next 20 years. Some of that is because some of the very large areas of planting are carried out by contract planters, and they plant when they get the trees regardless of the conditions. And I've been talking to a friend of mine who volunteers with me, and he's just planted several thousand trees over the summer, and he says it's a real shame they will all die because you don't plant trees in the summer, but in contract planting you plant when you're paid to plant. So millions and millions of the trees that we grow in our tree nurseries and then plant will have to be replaced almost immediately, and that seems counterintuitive to me and counterproductive. So one of the things that Woods for the Trees were thinking of is where can we get new trees from that would give us a network all over the country for producing new trees that we could plant. And if I click on that link, that should take us to a page on our website, which is it's Jonathan's rather splendid logo here. We have a scheme that's just starting up called Nuts for the Trees, which almost speaks for itself. What we're going to do is we're getting schools to collect seeds and nuts and plant them. And then we're going to encourage the children at those schools to look after those seedlings till they're a year or 2 years old, and to think about trees and how you grow them, and to enjoy the miracle of growing a tree from seed or a nut. And then we're going to get them to think about where they might plant them. And that means getting involved with local communities possibly, and finding local people with land, and basically putting together a social ecology from the ground upwards. So we think that may go some way towards not just providing some of the millions of trees we need, but also involving people in a very intimate way with regenerating woodlands. Now we have we get a question from Roger. Hi, Roger. He says, seeding instead of planting, ? Are we still importing large numbers of tree seedlings from abroad, as this seems to have been problematic for the introduction of disease? Well, it would be nice to think we've stopped importing tree seedlings from abroad, because quite why we needed to import all the ash trees that were diseased from Europe, which as we speak are destroying our ash woodlands, I don't know. It's a failure of government policy. Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, Roger. In fact, I'm going to change my slide as we speak and include Roger's idea. So in between importing trees, tree nurseries and natural regeneration, if I could spell trees right, one of the things we can do is actually sow tree seeds. And that's a good idea. Essentially what you do is you scarify the land and then you sow tree seeds. I do think that's a really good idea. There don't seem to be many people doing it, but I don't know why it's not done more often. It's partly, I think, because there's actually no incentive. So none of the incentivizing government schemes are really working that way. But I do think it's a good idea. You of course need good local appropriate supplies of seeds, and that's not the matter of a moment to acquire. But it is a good question. Let's go back to the slideshow. Some other questions. Margaret, when trees are planted which are not looked after, these trees cannot be listed by people who will plant in groups in different locations. Trees are planted and looked after, these trees. I'm not quite sure what you mean by that. Perhaps you could clarify. When trees are planted,
yes.
which are not... Hello, Margaret,
yes.
Explain.
It's a typo. I put used, but it's put in listed.
Oh, okay.
They can't be used. if people are that wide expanse of trees that you showed,
Yeah.
if they're not looked after, then as you say, they go to waste.
Yes.
If they had been reallocated instead of to somebody planting huge plantations,
Yeah.
to localize people. For instance, I'm in Ashford in Kent, and the borough has set up a scheme of tree wardens, part of which some of they've suggested that what we might do is have tree nursery to plant local trees or seeds collected locally, bring them on and then plant them. And part of the tree warden's job will be to help to get trees planted in areas in Ashford where there's open space, which could do with having trees, and also to look after the trees that are in the borough, which is a lot of it's quite rural.
I think that's a brilliant way of killing several birds with one stone, and that's very much along the lines of thinking of woods for the trees. Yeah, I think that's a great idea. And I mean, trees once planted don't always readily transplant, but years and years ago, a colleague of mine, John Vaughan from the Great North Forest, had a brilliant idea of planting a substantial number of the trees in a new plantation in biodegradable pots, and after a year or so, having been nursed by other trees, you could then lift them and then take them to new locations. Yeah, I think there are all sorts of creative ways in which we can establish trees and get people, especially young people with time on their hands, involved in planting and nurturing and seeing those trees through into a sort of a productive phase of their life. So that's, yeah, good. Joy, sorry, Jonathan?
Yes, I was going to say we're nearly out of time, but Joy has added something very interesting to the chat.
Yeah, Joy says this social ecology looks as if quite modest plantations in residential areas where the people for the ecology are numerous could be one of the best and most readily accessible actions and could utilize quite small parcels of land. Yeah, that's right. And in fact, we do have a slide at some point. Yeah, here. I was going to talk about microforests, which are forests really the size of no bigger than a tennis court, in which you can have a very rich habitat, potentially productive little forest garden with nuts and fruit and other edible plants on a very small scale, relatively small scale, using odd scraps of land. And I think the value in those is not just that you get the trees, but that you get people interested in, as it were, stakeholding the future of those trees by becoming involved, and then perhaps thinking about having acquired skills of nurturing and planting and growing trees from seeds, can then go on to think about more ambitious projects. There is a lot of available land for trees, and in fact that's one of the discussions we might have at some point. We'll, I think, Jonathan, be keeping our chat open for the next week, won't we, so that people who haven't seen this will be able to catch up on it, and we'll keep the conversation going.
Absolutely, Max. Yes. So I just posted a few links for everyone, and what I'd like to do just to finish off with just take you to those links, if that's okay, Max.
I'm already there.
Okay, brilliant. Yeah, so this is our website, Woods for the Trees. Please do have a look if you can. I'd like to point out to two things. So first of all, our webinars page, where we now feature our Cambridge Zero talk. If you could navigate there, please, Max.
Sorry, say that again. Webinars page.
Webinars page, yes, please.
Beg your pardon, I was distracted.
So the New Wood Age, which is what we've been talking about today, it has its own page there, and if you click through to that, please, Max. What we'll do, if you have any thoughts after this, please leave them in the chat below as a comment. We will be putting the video and the slide deck from the talk today on there as well. and all those people who signed up who weren't able to make it for whatever reason, obviously it's them. But please do put your thoughts in there. That would be very much appreciated. And the last thing I want to just show you is if you go to the shop, please, Max.
I think this is what we call the pack shot, isn't it?
That's right. So there's some things you can buy on here to support us. We're starting fairly small, but we have hoodies and t-shirts. I'm wearing a t-shirt today. Anyone is wearing them around where I live. Please do have a look at those, and if you like them, a lot of the money that you spend there on that, and also on Max's books, will go towards Wood for the Trees and help us keep going. So thank you very much for that.
So the slides and the chat will be on our website for the foreseeable, won't they, Jonathan? And on the Cambridge Climate Zero website, I think, for the foreseeable, on their YouTube channel.
Okay. Right. So thank you very much, everyone, for attending. It's been a pleasure to host you and a pleasure to take part in Cambridge Zero.
Good. Take care, everyone.
Cheers.
Thank you for an excellent talk.